Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 National American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva and Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center via our website and social media outlets on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group.
This month's Global Connections topic is freedom of speech on campus. We thank our special guest, Talia Dror, student leader of Cornellians for Israel, Professor Susannah Heschel, Chair of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College, and Kenneth Stern, Director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
In past panels, we've discussed the recent increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. There have also been polls showing that support for Israel, while it's greater among older Americans, it's been losing out among younger adults. And it's no surprise to me that politics on college campuses can be more passionate and performative than carefully reasoned. I cut my teeth on the college radio station anchoring coverage of the big 1968 protests at Columbia University. But having experienced all that and knowing all that, the situation on many campuses since October 7th has still been surprising, certainly for me. Jewish students describe feeling afraid. Israel's military action against Hamas, designed to degrade and decapitate, if not entirely eliminate, the Islamist group, has prompted loud protests against Israel, in particular on several elite campuses. There are claims and counterclaims over rights to free speech when it comes to Israel, Hamas, and Gaza. Critics of Israel say they're exercising their freedom of speech. Many Jewish students say they're being denied the very freedom to live and to study without fear. In this hour, we'll explore questions of free speech on campus with three panelists. Our first panelist is one of those Jewish college students I spoke of. Talia Dror is in her final year at Cornell's School of Industrial Labor Relations. She is also minoring in business and legal policy and is a member of Cornellians for Israel. Talia Dror was one of three students who co-authored an op-ed for the New York Times with the headline, "What is happening on college campuses is not free speech." Talia Dror, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Robert. Thank you so much for having me on.
And I'd like you to begin by telling us what you experienced at Cornell after the Hamas attack on towns and kibbutzim near Gaza.
Right. So that's a pretty loaded question. Yeah. It's been 60 days since then, and the amount of sheer anti-Semitism we've seen unfold on our campus is abhorrent. It started with actually resolution that was entered by the Student Assembly, which I did speak about at the hearing, in which the LGBTQ representative on the Student Assembly introduced a bill that essentially glorified Hamas as resistance fighters and placed full blame for the October 7th attacks on Israel. Since then, we've seen numerous protests done by the Students' Justice for Palestine group on our campus, in which they have chanted anti-Semitic phrases like "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." They've chanted for intifadas. They have been essentially tormenting students on campus by graffitiing all over campus saying Zionism equals genocide and intifada now. These are direct threats to Jewish students on campus. I think it was we ended up getting death threats on an anonymous platform with one radical student who unfortunately was facing dire mental health situations, who had essentially posted on an anonymous posting platform saying that he was going to kill all Jews on our campus and rape all Jewish girls and shoot up the kosher dining hall and for Jewish living. Obviously, this sent shockwaves throughout our community. Students were genuinely afraid to go to classes. We had students attending Zoom classes only for about a week or so. It was funny, though, because Students' Justice for Palestine condemned anti-Semitism and then immediately resumed to call for the elimination of the state of Israel and all 7 million Jews inside of it. Most recently, the Students' Justice for Palestine group occupied student buildings. They slept in student buildings and defaced our main building on campus, with Palestinian flags replacing the American ones, and putting posters all over the front of our main building on campus. Upon speaking with the administration has said that they are not going to receive any consequences for their various rule violations.
Talia, let me ask you two questions. First, did the intensity of this anti-Israeli, and you would say anti-Semitic reaction to October 7th, first of all, did it surprise you, or did it confirm your understanding of what opinions were among your fellow students? And second, do you think it reflected a majority of Cornell students in what you were hearing?
So first, I wasn't surprised. Unfortunately, anti-Israel sentiment has been vocal on campuses for a long time. Professors feel emboldened now to speak against Israel and to speak in anti-Semitic fashions in their classrooms. And right now, what they're doing is using their captive audiences to preach their terrorist sympathies. And they are empowering students to spread these anti-Semitic, anti-Israel rhetoric. And then in terms of the majority of students feeling this way, I mean, 51% of students believe that Hamas is a resistance, or 51% of the people in my generation, Gen Z, believe that Hamas is a resistance force. I would hope for more moral clarity, but I don't think that's the case.
Were you concerned for your physical safety during that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I received death threats.
I believe you may have testified to this, but your dorm room at Cornell has a mezuzah. It would be identified as the home of a Jewish student.
That's correct, and I live with 2 other student leaders who are prominent in the community.
And even in your room, were you concerned, afraid?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to ask you about one thing you said, which has engendered a tremendous amount of discussion, which is this "from the river to the sea." This is a pro-Palestinian slogan, which would presumably mean from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, only Palestine is the implication. Since it would wipe out Israel, it's received as not just an anti-Zionist, but an anti-Semitic statement. I have to confess, I first heard the "from the river to the sea" as a statement of the where there would be necessarily only one sovereignty, Israeli sovereignty. It was a Likud party position from their founding. And I wonder what you say to someone who says, well, I don't think the Israelis are that eager to have another sovereign nation between the river and the sea. What's the difference between the Israeli position and what the pro-Palestinians are saying?
It's a really great question. I think the pro-Palestinian "from the river to the sea Palestine will be free" was initially "from the river to the sea Palestine will be Arab." It was then adopted by multiple recognized terror organizations and used in their efforts to eliminate Jews. And I think that the difference between those two phrases of "from the river to the sea" is under one phrase, Jews will be eliminated. And under the other one, everyone will live under sovereign equal citizenship. So, I mean, currently you have 2 million Arab Israelis as citizens of Israel.
Yeah.
I can't see any Jews being left by Hamas, considering their vile and disgusting anti-Semitic brutal attacks. Whereas I can see equal citizenship being given to by an Israeli ruled from the river to the sea.
I've read some columns in the Cornell Daily Sun, which have been written by their guest columnist, an English professor who's been teaching at Cornell for 56 years, Daniel Schwartz, who describes himself as a Jew and an advocate of a two-state solution, a supporter of Israel and all that. He deplores the acts of and statements of anti-Semitism. But he did write this: the campus, meaning Ithaca, has not devolved into chaos, nor has anyone been physically harmed. Despite a fraught environment, most faculty and students have been going to classes and doing what they usually do. Yes, Jewish students have felt uncomfortable, especially before the student culprit was arrested, but almost all attended and kept up with classes. Does that describe more or less to you, does that square with your sense of the campus as we're about 2 months away from October 7th?
Interesting. I'm really glad he feels that way because most Jewish students that I've spoken to and most students large don't feel the same way, especially after what happened this past weekend with students sleeping in school buildings and violating policies, and the clear showing of the administration's double standard in terms of addressing these things. This has turned not only into a Jewish issue, but a widespread issue of students coming to realize, students and parents coming to realize that our universities are devolving into places where anti-American, anti-Semitic, and anti-humane rhetoric has been spreading, and everyone is getting uncomfortable, both my non-Jewish and my Jewish friends.
Talia Dror of Cornell, thank you. Stay with us because we're going to have a discussion period in about 20 minutes. But first, we're going to turn to our second panelist, Professor Susannah Heschel of Dartmouth. She is chair of Jewish Studies there, and she has a close relationship with Dartmouth's Middle East Studies Department. That relationship came into play after October 7th, as we'll hear in a moment. Far from New Hampshire right now. She's in Warsaw, actually based right now in Berlin in a course that she teaches for Dartmouth. She's a historian and a scholar of, among other things, the history of anti-Semitism in Germany, which could be germane. Professor Heschel, thanks for joining us. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much.
Describe your reaction to the attacks on October 7th and what you did about it.
So I was, of course, devastated and shocked and horrified and terrified. And I think for a long time, I felt a very odd combination of despair and rage simultaneously. But that weekend, I decided I should have faculty gather over lunch, perhaps on Tuesday in our seminar room, people from my building, just to talk with each other. And then I got a call from my colleague who's chair of Middle Eastern Studies, and he was in Cairo leading a Dartmouth program, and he called me and he was terribly upset by what had happened on October 7th, the terrorist attack against Israel. His name is Tariq El-Aris, and he grew up in Beirut during the Civil War. He's a forthcoming memoir about it. But he was devastated, and he told me that the social media in the Middle East was horrifying to him, what people were saying, horrible. So I told him about the lunch, and he said, make it bigger, open it to everyone. So we did. And so on Tuesday and Thursday of that week, we set up a faculty forum. 4 of us on the faculty at Dartmouth came to answer questions and to talk with students. It was open to all the students, faculty came. Turns out we ended up with hundreds attending in person and thousands on a live stream. So we answered questions, but I think what was most important was that we as faculty modeled something for the students. We demonstrated to them how we speak to each other in academic terms with collegiality, with respect. Certainly nobody on that panel was anything but devastated by the horrific attacks. But we also made it clear to the students that we're not here to to blame, but to learn. That's what they should be here to do, and not to litigate the past, but to think about the future. Mm-hmm. But we created, I believe, an atmosphere of calm. There were student prayer vigils held on campus in subsequent days and weeks, but we did not have the kind of horrific incidents that took place at Cornell and so many other schools.
I've heard you say that the close connection between you and Jewish studies at Dartmouth and the Middle East studies at Dartmouth is unusual. Why is it unusual? Why should there be a gap there?
It is unusual, and frankly, it shouldn't be unusual. It should be commonplace, and I don't know why it isn't commonplace everywhere, but I can tell you that I have colleagues in Jewish studies who say they have receive no response when they reach out to their colleagues in Middle Eastern studies. It's as if there's a war on certain campuses. And that's not what we have at Dartmouth. We cross-list our courses, we co-teach, we co-sponsor lectures and workshops. We are working with reasonable people who are concerned and humane and engaged. And we feel that when we do teach courses that are on delicate topics, such as, for example, the course in anti-Semitism, but also we just have a course now on the 1967 war about Israel and Palestinians. We co-teach. We have 2 professors in the classroom, and I think that generates a different atmosphere, and that's what should be done. So a lot of this depends on individual faculty.
And you don't get accused of false equivalence in that case by having 2 professors?
No, it's not about false equivalence. It's about demonstrating how we speak about these issues, right. And how to keep calm. What are the academic questions? What's the research that we need to do? How can we understand something better? And 2 in the room makes a difference for the atmosphere.
One aspect of free speech on campus is what activists and students say, and where you draw the line between speech that should be disciplined and speech that's disturbing, but someone has a right to it. And another dimension is just what faculty say in the classroom and feel free to say. Do you feel any constraint about your thoughts about the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, or should you feel some restraint about expressing your thoughts about Israelis and Palestinians?
Yes, I do, because I believe there's a difference between private life and public life. I have private thoughts and I speak to my friends and my family, but I also have a professional career. And as a professional, whether someone is a doctor, a lawyer, a plumber, whatever it is, I don't want to know the private thoughts. I want someone who will behave with professionalism and with dignity. And that's my obligation as a professor. I don't believe professors should be ranting and raving on campus, as some of them have done. I find it outrageous and insulting to the university community when, for example, at Cornell, Russell Rickford said he was exhilarated by October 7th. What kind of a person is that, first of all? Yeah. And what's the message to the students? It's like putting a sign in, students should not take a class with me. And I can tell you at Dartmouth, students don't like that kind of person and that kind of behavior.
In your scholarly career, you've written about anti-Semitism in Germany. Speaking as someone of Russian Jewish ancestry, I grew up hearing about the folly of German Jews, as my father would tell it, people who believed in the acceptance that they enjoyed, only to discover they were then ruled by the most vile anti-Semites that we've ever seen. Should we be hearing in the anti-Israel outbursts these days the sound of broken glass in the distance, or is this something obviously less calamitous than that?
In some ways more calamitous, because the feeling that I have right now is that the whole world has gone mad. Mm-hmm. It's not confined to a particular place, and it's not confined to a particular segment of society. Now, of course, I also don't think that Jews are to be blamed for anti-Semitism, whether it's Jews in Germany for the Nazis, or whether it's Jews in France for the Dreyfus affair, whether it's Jews in Iraq for having been exiled from Iraq, and so forth. But the rise of anti-Semitism right now is horrifying. It's coming at us from every possible direction. And I am very concerned about what can be done at this point and how long this kind of hysteria, it's a hysterical anti-Semitism. It's a kind of madness. How long will this persist? Decades? Generations? I'm not sure, but it's shocking. It's horrifying. And of course, Israel was always the promise, the answer, the antidote will go to Israel. But then came October 7th. And now Jews feel even Israel isn't safe.
Sir, Susannah Heschel, thank you. And stick with us, because in 10 minutes we'll bring all of you back. But we're going to turn now to our third guest. Our third panelist is Kenneth Stern, who is a writer, lawyer, director of Bard College's Center for the Study of Hate. Over the years, he has studied hate as it appears in American militias, on talk radio, as well as on campus. And one aspect of his work that's especially relevant these days to what we're talking about was his role as a drafter of the working definition of anti-Semitism, which is also called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. Ken Stern, welcome. It's always good to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be with you.
The working definition, which for shorthand I'll call the IHRA, has been approved by the European Parliament, by many other bodies. Its examples of anti-Semitism include some criticisms, certain kinds of criticisms of Israel. The chanting about Palestinians being free from the river to the sea is by definition an anti-Semitic chant.
Well, first, it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. There are certainly anti-Semites who use that. Certainly when Hamas uses it, it is. You don't need a definition to know that. But there are some people for whom the idea of, especially when you're talking about 18, 19, 20-year-olds on a college campus, that may have this idea that, well, one person, one vote, let's have, from one side to the other. Your point about Likud as using that phrase too in a different way. So I don't see it as necessarily anti-Semitic. The definition, however, was put together primarily to help European data collectors figure out how to put reports about anti-Semitism together after the Second Intifada. And there were examples about language about Israel because we saw, as we're seeing now, a correlation with some types of speech and attacks on Jews. Not to say that there was a causation, but a correlation. But it was never intended to be used, as some are trying to use it now, as a hate speech code to define what could be said on campus and what can't. And part of the problem for me studying hate is that people get into these binary boxes where they see something that disturbs them, their identity. They want justice on one side, injustice on the other, want to label something, want to make complicated things simple. And people are trying to use this definition to say, okay, well, there's certain speech that we shouldn't allow, and that's the end of it. And, what you hear from students, from people like Susannah, who are very invested in teaching, is that we want to use the educational system the capacity to mine these issues, why people have these different points of views, to understand, what's driving them, to put yourself in their minds and to understand, how do you teach? At Bard, we're going to do a class in the spring instead of having just these words flung around like anti-Semitism, genocide, settled, or colonialism. What do they mean? How do we study them? How do we understand them? So to the extent that we can, look at the complexities and take people out of these binary boxes, the better. But the definition is being used to say, let's put something on one side of a line or another and then move on. And we miss all the important things we can do on a campus to fix the climate and to educate people.
Have you developed for yourself a clear sense of where the line is between disturbing speech that's critical of Israel or of supporters of Israel, and speech that either becomes hate speech or becomes action in itself? Is there some line in your head that's the out of bounds line here?
That's a great question. So to me, the difference is between expression on one side, which could be done by speech, but could also be done by other things, art and other ways, and intimidation, harassment, bullying, and discrimination. So if somebody wants to get up and say, from the river to the sea, or I think all, fill in the blanks, Jews in this case, but blacks or gay people or transgender, whatever, should die, it depends on, the context. If I could say that as an expression, it should be condemned. People should, talk about why this is problematic and organize around it. But to give the campus the ability to say that when you say certain things, even things that we may find very, very hateful, that's going to put you in a problem where you're going to have a disciplinary effect. That does a number of things. First of all, it puts the people that are being targeted for their speech as free speech martyrs. It changes the discussion again about how the campus should be thinking about these issues, and it undermines the ability, I think, to teach. And just one thing to say too is from the book I put together 3 years ago when I saw these issues, it's not just on one side. We've seen what we're talking about now with the anti-Zionism and Jewish students and the boycott and the hecklers and so forth. But when I talk to pro-Palestinian professors in the last few weeks, they tell me they too are having students coming into the door crying that they're being called terrorists. They're seeing, trucks going around in Columbia and Harvard doxing students, Students for Justice in Palestine, and Brandeis, just for its expression, stopped. That's a problem too. When we try to silence each other from things that we find disturbing, we're doing no one any favors.
On the questions, one of the questions that's arisen since October 7th was what should university presidents say about October 7th, which raises a question from my mind. Should we expect university presidents to announce the position of the university on what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs, or what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, or what Hamas is doing in Gaza? What is your answer to that?
Yeah, I think this moment reflected the wisdom of something called the Calvin Report from '67 from the University of Chicago that said universities should not be making statements about public issues in general. Because we see, what happens in a situation like this. It gets picked apart. It's either not strong enough on one side or the other side, or it's not. If it's strong on the side that I agree with, it's not in the same words that I would want. And then the issue becomes one of what the president said as opposed to what the campus is doing, like what Susannah and others did at Harvard. So again, it's putting people in the binary of a simple thing. I thought the best statement that I saw was from Maud Mandel at Williams, which was a detailed statement about why she wasn't putting out a statement, but really stressing the things that were important. That we understand that students are in a moment of stress, that we understand students may have family and people they care about in Israel and in Gaza, and we recognize that. We're doing vigils, we're doing forums like Susannah and others have done, and we've done some at Bard as well. So the only time I think a statement that could come out about an incident that's political like this should be, to ratify that students are recognized and feeling heard, and also to talk about the importance of academic freedom and expectations. Again, not going to be any harassment, not going to be any intimidation, but we're going to mind why students have the, difficult different opinions and create the avenues for them to explore it. Those types of statements are okay. Yeah. But a college president is not the equivalent of a State Department.
Yeah, I've heard it described as the Chicago approach that I don't know how accurate it is today, but the idea that the university per se and the university president should not be expressing positions on great issues, precisely to leave members of faculty free to express whatever they wanted, and they were all individuals. The institution wouldn't.
That's right, but one of the criticisms, I mean, this is post George Floyd, when a lot of college presidents started making statements. And so, now we're at a moment where we see everybody agreed that what the officer did with the video of the George Floyd was awful. But this is an issue where people have strongly divergent views of the justice on one side or the other. I have my own views, but I know others have different views. And for a college to, come down on on a political issue like this, the problems of doing that, and the wisdom of the Calvin Report from Chicago so many years ago.
Yeah, today's polemics about Israel and the Palestinians sent me thinking back about 60 years ago to a time when Arabs frequently argued that none of today's Jews, certainly not in Israel, are actual Jews, that they're all descended from converts of the Khazar tribes in Central Asia. And it was routinely put out by the Israeli government that being a Palestinian was a made-up identity that really was people thought of themselves as South Syrians before Jews came along, and they made up an identity just to bother the Jews. So at some level, we've come some ways from two peoples both saying to each other and their supporters saying, "You're a complete fraud and a fake. You don't exist as a people whom I have to confront and I have to deal with."
And absolutely right. And that's the binary in this. Again, just seeing one narrative as being, legitimate, as opposed to finding a way to have empathy for all people with, the different narratives. And in my book, it was interesting because I decided I had to have a chapter about what are the narratives. So I had the Israeli Jewish narrative that, we all know from the connection to the land and the history and the synagogues facing Jerusalem and all that. And then I had the Palestinian narrative, which was, basically they were always there. Jews were a minority. Others started coming in at late 1800s. And then I had somebody look at the draft of the chapter, and she said, it really is important which one you put first. And I thought about that, and I put the Jewish Israeli one because that's the one that I believe and I'm most comfortable with. But then I had a long footnote. I said, "But imagine if you're an Israel supporter like I am, and imagine if I had started with the Palestinian narrative and started talking about, this just the Palestinian story, and the Jews were brought in as secondary characters to try to undermine our ability to control our lives. How would that make you feel?" And that's how a lot of the pro-Palestinian folks feel. And what we have is the, two narratives that are not intersecting, but just going right past each other. And I think the point of education is to make it so that people can entertain both simultaneously. They can have their views about which is the more just, but they should understand that both of them exist and are credible.
Ken Stern, thanks a lot. Stay with us. I'd like to welcome back Professor Susannah Heschel and Talia Dror from Cornell.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think there's something to be said for open discussion and free inquiry. I mean, the reason I pay to go to the institution I currently attend is to engage with people who have different views than me, who grew up with different narratives and have different perspectives, and to share that. But what we're seeing right now is, because of the sheer amount of force and inability to sit down with peers who have different views, everyone sees this as an environment of intimidation. And one group's free speech rights has been limiting the other group's free speech rights. And so it is within the freedom of speech and freedom of protest of any pro-Palestinian group to call for an intifada. But if the call last week that was made was intifada from Gaza to Ithaca, calling for an intifada on my campus, calling for terror attacks on Jewish students on my campus. Now, the university recognizes that as free speech, but that free speech inherently undermines my personal free speech as a Jewish student, because now I feel uncomfortable to hang a mezuzah up, which is within my religious free speech rights. I feel uncomfortable saying that I'm a Zionist because I'm afraid I'll be targeted and killed. So while I do respect free speech, I think it's having an adverse effect right now.
We're going to come back to the word intifada in just a moment. But first, Susannah Heschel, anything you'd like to remark on from what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
Yes. Well, I very much appreciate what Talia said. I actually don't think it's about free speech, because I think it's really about the fact that most administrators don't seem to know what Jewish history is, or what, as was my impression after listening to the 3 presidents who testified yesterday before Congress. But certainly to say intifada would be, to me, the equivalent of a student running around calling for lynching of African Americans. And in fact, for that matter, there have been incidents in which a noose is hung from a tree at a university in the United States, and those students are condemned immediately by the administration. And that's a symbolic act. It's not verbal, but hanging a noose is a very powerful threat. And it's a racist threat. An intifada, calling for intifada, is calling for violence, is calling for murder. Now, why is that any different? Why should that not be immediately condemned? It has nothing to do with free speech. It has to do with this is a campus, a college. You don't say certain things. You don't, as the Supreme Court say, you don't cry fire in a crowded movie theater.
And Ken Stern, reactions to your
listen, I understand and I appreciate, and if I were, in a situation where there were calls, especially what was after the colon in a way that was implied by Talia, to target Jews on campus, that would clearly be something that would be a direct threat. I don't know what all students may mean by intifada. I know what I hear, what it means, what Susannah hears, and what Talia hears. But the question is, again, what you would want a college administrator to do about policing speech. If it's just saying something that we find is awful, and that other students are feeling something threatened by it, but it's not a true threat because it's just an expression. You say things that ratify the fact that all the Jewish students should feel on this campus. Years ago, I did a report on bigotry on campus, and the question I asked is, what would you do if a person put a sign that said, so-and-so, whatever group is not welcome on this campus on a dorm, and there was no rule against putting, signs on dorms. And one of the college presidents said, I would put a bigger sign on my office that said, everybody welcome here. So I think if you answer speech with speech, the idea that you try to regulate what speech and to get into the minds of people, unless it comes in the context that it's actually a true threat or harassment or directed in emails or to somebody in the dorm, I think you have to allow it and teach about it.
Professor Heschel shaking her head vigorously, so I'll give you a moment here. Yes?
So, first of all, what Talia has described, the kind of behavior at Cornell University, is not just a question of whether it makes Jewish students feel violence. It is an insult to the university and everything the academic world stands for, the values and the principles, and in no way should it be allowed. And that's why when someone finds a noose hanging at a university, it's immediately condemned. It's not about Black students feeling unsafe. It's an antithetical to a university. So that's that. Now, when it comes to the term intifada, if somebody calls for a boycott is not a threat of violence. An intifada is a threat of violence. There is no such thing as intifada without violence. So if someone says, okay, I'm going to boycott Israel, and I'm not going to buy, orange Jaffa oranges, fine. You can do, that's your business. If you really want to boycott, you're going to have to give up your computer. You're going to have to give up your iPhone because they contain technology that's produced in Israel. You have to give up a driverless car also, because that was also invented in Israel by Amnon Shashua. So to boycott is passive. To threaten with intifada, every university should condemn it outright. It's the same as calling for lynching. What's the difference?
Susannah, would you discipline a student? Would you discipline a student? Would you expel a student? Would you create a list of?
Yes, I would, or at the very least suspend a student for a year and say, look, I'm not sure you understand what a university is all about, that this is not behavior or thinking or kind of language that we tolerate here.
I'd also like to add, I apologize. Yes. I'd like to add that within the values of every university, there are certain core values that are stated, one of them being a community of belonging, another being freedom of speech. But the second that freedom of speech value starts to impede on the community of belonging value, people need to be reprimanded and disciplined. And also, I didn't like a lot of what Claudine Gay said yesterday in her testimony, but something she did say is that the way to fight hatred is with truth. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of misinformation being spread on campus. Students spreading misinformation should not be given the platform to do so. Yeah. That is the university's right to not give them the time or place and restrict their freedom of speech to spread lies.
Let me just interrupt here to say, first of all, Claudine Gay is the president of Harvard University. She appeared at a hearing along with the presidents of MIT and Penn, the House committee hearing that was looking into anti-Semitism on campus. Representative Elise Stefanik of New York, an upstate New York Republican, questioned them, and she was the one who put the Intifada question. But in the course of posing it to them, she defined Intifada as a call for armed resistance that calls for genocide of Jews, and I had to think about that for a while, because actually in my years overseas and on short trips overseas, the Middle East wasn't the only conflict zone that I saw, and there were times when the provisional IRA in Northern Ireland would conduct what might be the equivalent of an intifada, an uprising over the sovereign authority in Northern Ireland, and it was murderous. These were not good guys. They were violent guys, but I didn't think it was genocidal. I didn't think that their aim was to wipe out all of the Protestants in Northern
That's
Ireland.
not. I understand, but Intifada, whatever Representative Stefanik understands, Intifada is about armed resistance, about physical violence, not just a boycott or not just disagreement on political issues.
Is it genocidal, though, is my question.
But I think that the other question that's being raised here by Talia is quite okay. I want to talk about truth. That is, we have misinformation that's being spread or biases, et cetera. But how can we do that if the faculty we're hiring are not able to think in rational terms about the conflict that is a two-sided conflict in the Middle East? Israel is fighting against armed militias in Gaza. It's not fighting against civilians. It's fighting militias with armaments, with missiles, with guns. That's different. And the problem is that too many faculty present people of Gaza and Hamas as passive victims of Israeli oppressors, because there's a tendency to think in what I consider to be juvenile, toddler age categories of a good guy and a bad guy. And the good guys are Hamas and Israel is the bad guy. And I find that especially striking among my colleagues who are concerned about different aspects of oppression, let's say gender equality and sexual equality and so forth. What do they think Hamas is going to do if Hamas prevails to people who want to have a same-sex marriage or want to undergo transgender surgery, let's say? Why is this naive notion that all the oppressed people of the world have to come together and unite? I don't think a professor with tenure at an Ivy League university constitutes an oppressed person. And more than that, I have to say, what are the people in Yemen or in Sudan or in Ukraine or in Myanmar and in so many other conflict zones in Syria? What are they saying? What's the matter with these Americans? All they care about at American universities are Gazans. Why don't they care about us and what's being done to us in Yemen and Sudan and all these other places? These are the people who care about the oppressed, who care about racism and aren't speaking out for Black Africans in Sudan who are being murdered? Or when the Secretary General of the United Nations said that the killing in Gaza is the worst killing that he's seen in so many years, what do you think is going on in Ukraine and Syria and so forth? So what kind of rhetoric are we observing?
Good question. And I have a question that's been submitted for Talia. Do you think that Israeli policies, specifically referring to settlement on the West Bank, and I assume the new government in Israel. Do you think that these policies contributed at all to the support for Hamas in some way, that people are opposed to what they read of this Israeli government in particular?
That's a good question. I don't think so, because people are not critical of the current Israeli government or its policies. People are critical of the fact that the Israeli government exists. It's not the current government or the former government. It's the fact that there was an Israeli government and that Israel is currently the Jewish state. And that's why what you're seeing these clubs yell is that anti-Zionism doesn't equal anti-Semitism, because they're trying to excuse their anti-Semitism by saying that delegitimizing the state of Israel and its existence is okay. We're not arguing over policies. We're not arguing over the West Bank or Gaza or whether or not Israel pulled out in 2005. We're talking about the legitimacy of the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And there's absolutely a double standard there, because every other country in the world is able to be looked at as a legitimate state, except for one.
Thank you for that. I have a question. I'd like to hear whoever wants to answer it. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis accused the pro-Palestinian anti-Israel group Students for Justice in Palestine of being in league with Hamas, and a Florida state official ordered the chapters of the group at 2 state schools be deactivated. And there have been protests about that since, and counter-protests. Was Ken Stern, was DeSantis right to deactivate Students for Justice in Palestine?
No, he wasn't. And also, to add on to that, Brandeis Center and the ADL sent a letter sent to 200 college presidents, letter saying, please investigate whether there's material support for Hamas from SJP and consider taking action. Well, speech, as much as I deplore SJP's speech, is not material support. Material support is fundraising, coordination, and so forth. So, what DeSantis did was not only a violation of free speech, but also goes into the same sort of, promoting the binary response to a difficult situation. I think, remember, he also tried to, or did encourage not teaching about gender, not teaching about race, trying to protect students from hearing certain things. And that's, getting back to your first question, that's my concern about the push of the IRA definition for application to the campus too. I don't want government saying what can be taught, what can be said. I want, when things that we find is disturbing, to teach about that and create the environment so that could be done. But when we give government the power to tell student groups what their politics could be, just based on their expression, not on their actions, to me, it's harming academic freedom and democracy itself.
President,
sorry, if I could just,
Professor Heschel, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
I was going to say, this is actually something that I've been actively studying. It's also one of the topics of the congressional hearing that I testified at. It's interesting that you note the financial ties that SJP may or may not have, because the founder of SJP, Hatem Bazian, also founded AMP, the American Muslims for Palestine, which is linked to the IAP, the Islamic Association for Palestine, which financial wing, the Holy Land Foundation, is directly tied to Hamas. Hatem Bazian also has direct ties to Hamas. So SJP, the student group that we're seeing on campuses, has direct ties to a nationally recognized terrorist organization and should absolutely be kicked off of campuses. They are literally Hamas on campus.
And Professor Heschel, you would agree with that?
I agree. I agree with Talia, yes. And I would say that I also see no place at college campus for the Proud Boys, over the Ku Klux Klan, over any other white supremacist group. And to me, this is similar. It's just that we're not reacting the same way. And that's what troubles me.
I'd like to put something to all of you that was said by Mark Rowan, who's the CEO of Apollo Global Management, and is a very wealthy benefactor, or had been until recently, of the University of Pennsylvania, his alma mater. And he said on Bloomberg TV that what's at issue on campuses isn't really a challenge to free speech, but it's about the conflict between favored speech and unfavored speech, that some groups are favored, others are not, and that this is baked into the intellectual outlook of the university, that anything said by or about a favored group is good, and anything about an unfavored group, in this case, supporters of Israel, is going to be bad. So we don't get a study of the facts. We get a clash of perspectives and conflicting narratives. Does this ring true to you, Professor Heschel? Is it rowing onto something? Is this an academic, an intellectual tone to the American university these days?
I appreciate the support from Mr. Rowan, and I do want to see change come to all the universities, but I think the problem is much deeper and won't be reached just by cutting the funding. The problem is certain ways of thinking that have developed, especially within the humanities, but also in some of the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, and so on, a certain way of analyzing problems that puts the political configuration at the forefront. And especially these days, ideas of colonialism. So intellectual work also becomes a form of colonialism. In this respect, I fear that the humanities is committing suicide. The humanities are being defunded at many schools already, and I'm afraid that's going to only increase because the humanities are at the forefront of this kind of politicization of knowledge. And as far as that goes, I also see the far left and the far right behaving in the same way, mirroring each other with the kind of rhetoric and dogmatism that I hear in the shrill tone. But I fear that actually this is a problem that's quite deep in the ways that the different disciplines within the humanities have been functioning in recent years and producing a new generation of scholars who are very worrisome to me.
Very worrisome.
Very terribly worrisome.
And
if I could add,
Ken Stern, yes, go ahead.
So, I agree with the observation that people are trying to put complex things into binaries. What Susannah was talking about, colonialism, oppressor and oppressed, white and non-white, powerful and privileged and not powerful and privileged. And, that's not new in the sense, if you look at statements about Israel-Palestine going back to the Weather Underground in 1974, it reads just like an SJP statement from today about it, anti-imperialism, divide the world that way. So, what do you do if you're a funder? And I understand people wanting to pull their money because they don't like what's going on. But what I've been encouraging to do is, wait a minute, if the campus is really important to you, you should be investing. You should be investing so students understand the importance of academic freedom and how they should treat each other, and the importance of learning and critical thinking, classes on anti-Semitism, classes on how to have difficult discussions about divisive issues, whether it's this one or abortion or immigration or Trump or whatever, and how to really get into why we as human beings, which is the focus of hate studies, of why we get into these buckets where we're us versus them and try to reduce the world to these simplest terms. Those are the things we should be investing in, as opposed to just saying we don't like this particular speech about an issue that we care about deeply and we're going to go and avoid the campus.
I agree with you. I just am doubtful, let's say. I worry that those kinds of investigations can't be carried out by the current state of the academic environment. And just as an example, University of Pennsylvania Humanities Center had a conference on Palestinian literature. There's nothing wrong with having a conference on Palestinian literature. The problem with it was that the keynote was supposed to be given by Roger Waters from a band called Pink Floyd, which first of all would cost a fortune to put on. I'm not sure he appeared in person or on Zoom, but what is he doing there? What is he doing at an academic conference? He's a whatever.
Was he there even just to advocate for? Was he there to advocate for the Palestinian cause?
He was there because he's a very loud BDS supporter, a very anti-Israel person. That's why he was there. Now, that's not a conference on Palestinian literature. So the conference, the academic nature, was being subverted for a political gain by the University of Pennsylvania in organizing this. That was not a normal academic conference. That was a political agitprop.
Yeah. Why, if you could answer in a nutshell, what do you think drives the acceptance of Hamas? Why at this particular moment would you think that a very unlikely group to be embraced by American students seems to have some support? In a word, why?
Why? So I would say, first of all, very few members of American society or the university know much about Hamas, really don't. And I find that's true in many cases. That when some years ago, the MLA, Modern Language Association, wanted to have a BDS platform, people were signing it, and I would talk to them. And it turns out they didn't know anything. They didn't know what they were talking about. They don't know anything about Israel. Their friends signed it. There seemed to be something justice to it. I think the mood has changed now. With Hamas, it's a kind of thrill. It's outrageous to support Hamas, to be demonstrating with a lot of passion, the students. And I think perhaps some of that passion may be a sense of finally COVID is over. So let's just take out all of our rage. But why focus on Jews? Because Jews are the convenient target for rage, for anger, for disgust, and so forth. So, but there are, I think, probably some additional psychological factors in American society right now that we may not recognize for a while to come. I would say from the Jewish side, first of all, this whole discussion about the statements issued by presidents, I think, is a displacement. Everybody was horrified and shocked. We focused on statements, which are ultimately meaningless. We were focusing on that perhaps because we were so terrified and upset by the October 7th terrorist attacks. That's why we focused somehow. It just was a distraction. But also, I have to say, I was horrified. We were all horrified that Jews were attacked, and in such a vicious, horrific way. If something like that, I can tell you those faculty supporting Hamas right now, they would be outraged if they talked about the Tulsa race riots when this middle-class Black community of Tulsa, Oklahoma was suddenly attacked in what was a horrific riot on the part of white people, just completely destructive. So what's the difference here? Why are the people who were so outraged by racist attacks in America and not outraged by the terrorist attack there? And that's because there's been a buildup for years and years and years of anger at Israel for refusing to allow a Palestinian state, for the occupation, and so on. The entire rhetoric of that has now built to a crescendo. So it's no longer about 1967 and that occupation. It's about 1948, and Israel should just be wiped out. Now, there are so many things horrific about that we can't enumerate, but I would say the affect, the emotion, the passion, the rage right now that's terrifying to me in the United States at universities from students, but students are 18, 20, but from professors. And let's remember that these elite universities, well, perhaps these are the people, these universities are producing the next generation of professors. So of course we're worried about the elite universities. And we should be.
Well, thanks to all three of you for taking part in this enlightening hour. Professor Susannah Heschel of Dartmouth, Talia Dror of Cornell, good luck after graduation soon, and Kenneth Stern of the Bard Center in the Study of Hate. Many thanks to Joshua Plout, Roni Giuliano, and Ryan Sutton from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, and also to our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Thank you to our program sponsor, the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3, a national charitable organization representing in the United States Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva, in Greater Tel Aviv. The website is www.afrmc.org. At this time, when Israel and Hamas are at war, by the way, we'd like you to please consider making a donation to AFRMC's Emergency Medical Relief Fund. I'm Robert Siegel. This has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month.